Hi, I'm Gerry Duffy, and you are listening to the Breifne Earley Show.
Breifne, you come all the way from Ireland for this adventure.
Isn't Breifne Earley a real tonic, full of positivity?
It's an amazing story, Breifne, with a wonderful, happy ending.
All of those things on your bucket list wouldn't necessarily have led you to do the World Cycle Race.
27 countries, 490 days, 18,000 miles on a bike.
You've decided that's it, you're going to keep giving yourself challenges.
Welcome to the first ever episode of the Breifne Earley Show, where we're going to try and get you inside the mind of some of the world's most influential and inspirational people. The first person on my list to have a look inside what makes them tick was one of my biggest inspirations in my world, and one of the first people I go to when I have a crazy idea and looking for a little bit of a kick maybe to get me over the start line of that particular event is none other than Mr. Gerry Duffy. Gerry, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Breifne. I'm very honoured to be here.
We're going to talk plenty about your books in the next hour or so, but I want to start with a little bit about yourself. And we just kind of give the cliff notes for the listeners. You, maybe 15, 20 years ago, were overweight, very unhappy with where you were in your world, and you decided you're going to start running. And that led you through a whole series of personal achievements to where you became a best-selling author, motivational speaker, ultra-endurance athlete, Deca Enduroman champion, and running 32 marathons in 32 days, and plenty of other things as well, double Ironman and whatever. We'll come back to all of that and again, but that's a pretty phenomenal journey.
Certainly, a journey certainly that has had a lot of detail, I guess, in it. But I suppose when you throw it into 20 years, or 21 years at this stage, because it's this coming up to 21 years since I first took up running. Ironically, the vast majority of it has happened in the last 10 or 12 years, if the truth be told. And it's, I took up running, as you so rightly said, only in my kind of late 20s, 27 years of age. And I did it initially to lose weight. I had no divine master plan, and that's the truth. I guess maybe because I didn't have a plan at that stage, ironically, it kind of helped me because I just kept stretching. I lost the weight. I lost 3.5 stone over 18 months. Still fought a very difficult battle with the cigarettes. I went off them for a year and a half, went on them. But eventually I'm off them, I think, 13 or 14 years, thankfully, smoke-free. I've certainly learned an awful lot. I guess, and I heard, I was listening to an audiobook earlier in the week, and it was Brian Tracy, and he was talking about, we would need to live a lot of lifetimes to actually tap into what we're capable of in one lifetime. Given what we demand or what we extract of our potential when we get one shot at it. And it was a very interesting comment to make. And what I've learned is it's only since really I was 27 that I really started in some ways to tap into the potential that I never knew was there. But thankfully, through doing the kind of things that you've mentioned and a few things outside of sport as well, because, I still, I think my greatest achievement Breifne is, because I know what it took, was overcoming a fear of public speaking. Like that was 1,000 times harder than anything I've done in terms of running.
You detail that very well in the first book, Who Dares Runs, and it's kind of ironic now that you make your profession, you make your living from public speaking. Probably 90% of what you do is actually getting up and talking in front of people. What was in your mindset? I want to go back to that age. You're 27 years of age, 17 stone, am I right?
Just under 1610.
Yeah, so overweight, clinically obese, I suppose, in most people's worlds, and very unhappy with your appearance. I know you talk a lot about, and in the first book, about the photograph with Seve Ballesteros, one of your idols. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was big into golf as a kid. My dad, I kind of got that from my dad. We grew up near a golf course. My childhood was spent caddying for him and that kind of thing. And so I grew up with a great love of golf, and I was kind of an 80s kid. And Seve was the king in the golfing world in the 80s. Seve Ballesteros, he was the world number one golfer, 5-time major winner. And I got very excited in the summer of 1995 because I knew for a week I was going to get to meet him. It was set up through a mutual friend. I met him, he was in Ireland playing golf in Mount Juliet in the Irish Open. And I got to meet him, got a photograph taken with him, and I was very excited to meet him. But when I got the photograph developed, I recognised him in the photograph, but I actually didn't recognise myself because I'd left school without the weight that I'd put on in the next 10 years. I left school, without an addiction to cigarettes. And in the photograph, I'm 4.5 stone heavier than when I left school, and I'm an addicted smoker. And that photograph was a wake-up call and a monumental motivation. I was about to tear the photograph up because I said, no, maybe it's time you made change in your life, because I wasn't happy. And so I said, well, what are you going to do about it? Because the photograph it was like looking in the mirror. And, I decided to keep the photograph. I was about to tear it up, but I decided to keep it to serve as a motivation. And it's one of the things I talk about now is the value of imagery, visualization, or drawing images, writing down your goals. Keep them in front of you, because that was my first, goal-setting strategy, because it worked. I kept the photograph. I used it as a motivation. If I was having a weak moment in the next 6 months or 12 months, I used to look at the photograph and say, Joe, you don't want to be that person anymore. So I kept the photograph. I still have the photograph, the original, of the one taken with Sevi. Over 18 months, I lost 3.5 stone and started to make changes, and slowly but surely started to emerge from... I was in hibernation for 10 years because I was fine up to 17, but it was only when I was kind of 18, 19, when I had to take responsibility for myself, I kind of start to sink in the water, if it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I suppose I've been there on a personal level as well, and I recognise an awful lot of your story from my own life experience. I want to know what was in your mind the first time you laced up those runners and went out for a jog.
I actually still remember it. It was in the summer. It was in July of 1995. I still remember it. I still remember where I was living. I remember the friends. I was sharing an apartment with a very good friend of mine. He looked at me as if I had 10 heads when I came home with this pair of runners that I bought in my local sports shop. It was a Saturday morning. I do remember 2 things about it. Number one, I got up very early, but I always, or almost always, got up early. I got up early in boarding school. So that I kind of, in some ways, kind of kept up that discipline. It was a beautiful Saturday morning. I ran 1.5 miles in one direction, and then I realised, well, you have to go home now. So it actually became a 3-mile run, or probably a jog or a shuffle, if the truth be told. If I'm being really honest, the only motivation was, well, get home because that's where the cigarettes are. So,
So one of your issues actually helped you overcome the other issue in terms of the cigarettes, helped you get over the weight initially?
Well, the cigarettes got me home anyway.
Okay.
So they turned what I had no idea how far I was going to run the first morning. But I did. I did love it instantly. I was instantly addicted. And sometimes people say, are you addicted to running? Well, if that's an addiction, I'll take it all day long, because maybe it shows that there can be healthy addictions. Do I eat right? I do most of the time. So maybe I'm addicted to that as well. If I am, I can certainly live with that.
What about to someone who might be listening, who might be in the situation you were in 21 years ago, 20 and a half years ago, where they look at themselves, they might be carrying a bit of extra baggage, they might be carrying a little bit extra timber, just not really in the mindset to get themselves out there. Do they need to make that decision for themselves, or can it be made for them?
I think if you look at it as a long-term sustainment, I think we kind of have to take responsibility for it ourselves. Fine, somebody else could motivate us to do it, but ultimately I think motivation comes from within. It might work for a short term, but I think if you really want to make change, what I realised was, as soon as I made change, things started to change, and I realised, gosh, this was out there for you all along. And I think what I've learned and seen in other people, and maybe even in myself, is that's the fear of change is usually, and I learned that in public speaking, the fear of it, was far greater than the actual doing of it itself. The fear of it was monumentally tough. And that can be the same for anything, because challenges are always, different things for different people. So I'm a believer, that it has to be up to ourselves ultimately. But people can help us to achieve our goals, and I'm sure we'll get into that later in the discussion. But to specifically answer your question, I think ultimate motivation comes from within.
You talk about the fear of public speaking. Now, in the first book, it's actually one of the funnier incidents in the book, although I'm sure at the time you were absolutely petrified with the thought of getting up and speaking in front of a massive audience of, I think you said, 4 people. Explain to me a bit more about that event and in terms of what was going through your mind at the time.
Okay, I'd opened my own business. So this is a long time after I took up running. So we're talking about 2005. So I'm in my trying to figure out what age was I. I was kind of in my late 30s at this stage. I was running my own business at this stage, and I now call it the opportunity, but a speaking situation arrived in my business where I knew for 6 weeks I was going to have to speak in public, and I even that language has changed now. Now I realise I get to do things, but at the time, I knew 6 weeks in advance that I would be speaking. I didn't know how many people were going to be there, but it was part of what I did for a living at the time. And as soon as I made the commitment to do it 6 weeks in advance, my anxiety levels just went through the roof. I just became fearful, and the closer it got, the more fearful I became, to the point that I started to lose sleep. It definitely started to affect my health. I'm certain of it. And, with 5 or 6 days to go, I was incredibly anxious as a human being, like to the point of, just being, it's hard to describe just how difficult the period. It's definitely the most difficult period of my life, and that's the truth. And that might seem quite, I don't know whether people might say,
I'm pretty sure some people would consider getting up and doing 10 Ironman in 10 days as slightly difficult in terms of but I'm interested to think that you thought that just the thought of getting up and speaking was actually very difficult.
Well, you see, I'd had my own business for 2 or 3 years at that stage. I was thankfully building up a good business. I was well known in the town, business person in the town in which I lived. But my fear was, that I was going to make a fool of myself, that I was going to get up there and nothing would come out, and that people would say, gosh, look at that guy there, he couldn't even get up and speak. I genuinely thought it was impossible. And, that's why, you talk about the iron distance triathlons or the multiple marathons. But to a large degree, I thought I could achieve those. Public speaking, as far as I was concerned, was impossible. And so my mind was completely convinced that I couldn't do it. And I mean, not even 99% convinced, 100% convinced. But I knew I had to do it. And because it was in a public setting, it was all this mixture of anxiety that was going on in my head. And, 3 days out, I got a pain down my left arm. I got a pain across my chest. And I now realise what was going on. I went to a doctor, and, he said, maybe you should back off. You're obviously under stress. But so much had happened in the preceding kind of 8-9 years, briefly, where I'd managed to make things happen in my life that formerly I didn't. But now, and I bring it all back to running, because I was mentally fitter than I was, I said, come on, look at the other things that you've achieved. This is just the last hurdle. But if you stop here, if you let this hold you back, it could be something else next year or even next week. So don't do it. No matter how afraid you are, just keep going. So a part of my brain was saying, gosh, this guy's really serious. We're going to make it even harder for him. And I don't mind telling you, the 2-3 days before was the most difficult time I've ever had in my life in terms of anxiety.
And how did that actually materialize on the day?
On the day, it was horrific, if the truth be told. I got through it, so I don't over dramatize it, but in terms of what was going on in my mind, it was just the greatest fear of my life. 4 people turned up. I went to a hypnotist 2 days before, and he taught me some very useful techniques that I've since brought in to help me with other things. Definitely a couple of things that he said to me helped. I got through it. 4 people turned up, and I wasn't successful in terms of the business transaction, what I was trying to do on the day. But as far as I was concerned, because I'd spoken, I'd achieved the impossible, and I was deliriously happy that night. And I didn't realise it at the time, but the significance of that, briefly, only really started to play out in the weeks and the months and even in the years after that, because subconsciously it's like I had just broken down any barrier of perception of what's possible for me to achieve, because I'd achieved something that I genuinely thought was impossible. So when I used to look at business goals going forward, I say, well, in reality, how hard can that be? Because it's not impossible. You've already achieved the impossible. And I brought that, that's what it gave me such a gift to kind of, unveil any last remaining doubts of what I was capable of achieving relative to my own personal goals, whether they're, business or outside of business. And I really grew immeasurably over the next couple of years in terms of, number one, my mindset, and number two, my ambition, because I really started to raise the bar in terms of goals in all different areas of my life.
I do like the word impossible, though, because if you put an apostrophe between the I and the M, it becomes I'm possible. So I think there's nothing. I do agree with you 100%. There's absolutely nothing that's impossible in this world, and I think you're living proof of that. Most people would though consider even one Ironman as being impossible, one marathon, never mind an Ironman being impossible. But yet, in the summer of 2010, yourself and your friend Ken Whitelaw undertook to raise a substantial amount of money for a very, very good cause in Irish Autism Action, but also to undertake a mammoth challenge of 32 marathons in 32 days consecutive in each of the 32 counties on the island of Ireland. What would even possess you to come up with that idea?
Running, so I need to go back to 1995 because obviously the idea only came to me in 2008, but in 1995 the birth of the idea in some ways, or the platform for the birth of the idea was created. Because as soon as you go back to that very first run, with the cigarettes that we mentioned 10 minutes ago, I got a number of, I got physically fit, but I got lots of other things that I didn't even realize I was going to stumble across. I got mentally fitter. I didn't realize I was going to get that. But I also got something incredibly, in fact, I wouldn't even say incredibly precious, I'd say priceless. I woke up to the fact that I was alive. And that's a very significant statement. It's a very significant thing to stumble across. But I became consciously aware of the fact that I was alive. As soon as that very first morning, that July, Saturday morning, and I'm not saying I had this sudden eureka moment, but it's only when I reflected afterwards, in the weeks and the months and the years afterwards, I woke up to the fact I was alive. I started to ask more of myself. Things started to happen. I started to get happier in my life. And the more I did, the more I realized I could do. And I brought into different aspects. I brought into education. I brought into, I was working for a company at the time. I wanted to open my own business. I'm certain that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't taken up running. I'm certain of it, for me. So now we're fast forwarding kind of 10, 15 years later. I'm into triathlons. I'm into kind of half marathons. I've done my first marathon, did an Ironman triathlon. Then I did another Ironman triathlon literally 6 weeks later. And then I read a book, and ironically, I was very inspired by the book. And out of the book, I got an idea, and the idea was the consecutive marathon ambition that you mentioned.
I presume we're talking about Dean Karnazes here.
Dean Karnazes, Ultra Marathon was the book I read. Yeah, and when I researched what Dean had done, I got this idea, and he'd done something similar in the United States, and I said, gosh, I'd love to do something like that myself. And so I came up with this idea. It was in September of 2008. But I've learned a lot about how you can achieve goals, Breifne, and about how you can achieve what some people might see are unrealistic goals. What I did was I kept it to myself. I didn't tell anybody for a year because it wasn't realistic. So it became a 2-year goal. I was prepared to what I called serve an apprenticeship. But I said, well, I have to serve the apprenticeship before I go public on it, because if I can't achieve the apprenticeship, I'll never achieve the bigger goal, which was to run 32 consecutive marathons. So I set forward a course of climbing a ladder. And I said, right, to get halfway up the ladder, you need to dedicate a year of your life, albeit in a part-time capacity, because I was doing this for fun. So I went and I did the double Iron distance triathlon that you mentioned. When I did that, I got very physically fit. I was a lot fitter then than I ever had been before. But I realized, well, you're still only halfway there. So then I set another year to prepare for the 32 marathon challenge itself.
It's a massive undertaking, and I've ran one. I've completed a marathon. I don't know if I'll ever do a second one, but the thought of getting up and running even a 5K the following morning just would have been non-existent in my world. Now, obviously, you mentioned about the preparation that went into it on your behalf, which obviously helps a lot better. But what impressed me most about the 32 Marathon Challenge, as well as obviously just even the concept of it and successfully completing it, was that you actually got faster. You would expect people to tire and to grow, I suppose, bored of it maybe to some extent over the course of that month, those 32 days. But you actually got stronger and faster the whole way through that. What would you attribute that to?
I've learned an awful lot about goal setting. I've read a lot of books. I've experienced a lot. I've asked a lot. I've researched a lot. And one of the things I've learned, and it's my number one rule in the Goal Getter book, chapter 1 is the number one rule is respect the goal. And for Ken and I, this was not about 26, or it was not about 19, or it was not about 12. It was about 32. if we did one marathon or 23 marathons, we didn't feel like we would have achieved our goal. Our goal was to run 32 consecutive marathons. And so as a consequence, on day one, we had worked out almost, not quite to the minute, but we set ourselves a very modest target in terms of running relative to what we were capable of running a marathon in. Because it was not about running one marathon, it was about running 32 of them. So we knew that what we did on day one, or what we did on day one or day 5, on day 25, our bodies were going to say, how did you look after me on day 5? Because if you push me too hard on day 5, 25, it's going to be payback time. So we eased ourselves into the event. We ran modest marathons about an hour slower than we were capable of at that time in the first 2-3 days. And after about 5 or 6 days, we started to notice that we were getting faster by 3 or 4 minutes every day. I can't speak for Ken, but Ken then unfortunately got injured, and he did finish the event, but he had a completely different experience to mine. I was fortunate, I remained injury free. And so as a consequence, after about 10 or 11 days, I started to get 5 minutes faster, roughly, and it's not an exact science, but approximately 5 minutes faster every day. To the point that in the last 4 or 5 days, including Ken, because he was back from injury at this stage, without having taken days off, I might add, we ran all of our fastest marathons in the last week, which were an hour quicker in the last week than we were in the first week. So we were averaging in the last week, I think, 3.5 hours for every marathon. But I'm certain it's because we respected it. And respect encompasses a lot of different things. It means we trained for a year for it. It means we paced accordingly. It means, the body, and it doesn't matter whether it's a running goal, a business goal, a family goal, your body needs fuel, and fuel comes in the form of fitness and food. So food was a very essential part of it. Rest was an essential part of it. Psychology was an essential part of it. All these other components. And, as I explained to people, we were 2 amateurs, but we were incredibly professional about everything we did. And I think that's the reason why we were successful.
You finished 32 marathons, and within 12 months, you're back at the start line of another event. But when I say start line, there was no real line. You were actually standing in water at the start line of the event. 10 iron distance triathlons in 10 consecutive days. Most people listening to this will probably don't even believe that such a thing exists. But why take part in that? What was the motivation behind that? Obviously, you had the charitable aspect and the personal goal in the 2010 event, the 32 marathons. But in 2011, with the Deca Ironman or Deca Enduroman, what was the motivation behind that? Surely at this stage you've already proven you can do unbelievable feats of physical endurance.
Well, I'll start by saying I didn't get faster in that one. I got slower in the iron distance challenge. Motivation for doing it, 3 or 4 months after 32 marathons, I reflected on that ambition and what had been fortunate. And Ken and I had an amazing experience. I still, there's not a day goes by I don't think about what a gift that event was for me. But 3 or 4 months afterwards, in kind of October, November of 2010, I realized I still had a hunger to do something very challenging, and I wanted to do something harder. I didn't have 4 or 5 weeks. I worked for myself, and we looked on the marathon as a holiday of a lifetime, a one-off adventure. But I knew I could take 2 weeks, because most people have that fortune to be able to take a couple of weeks holidays. And for me, this, I love to do this kind of stuff, so I do see it as this is what you do in your spare time. I did a bit of research on the internet. I wanted something that was harder, but that took less time.
You definitely found that.
Definitely found it, yeah. It was, I don't mind telling you, it was incredibly physically challenging for me. But I found this event, and I was very physically fit, Breifne. I kept up the fitness. I ran a good marathon, fastest ever marathon in the Dublin Marathon in October of 2010. So I was in very good shape still. And I knew also the 30 marathon had given me a huge level of fitness, way above anything I'd ever, I was at a level that I was way beyond anything I had before. And I said, you could still tap back into that experience and that fitness because your body won't forget it. And so in January of 2011, I started 5 months of training for the Deca Iron event, which started in June of 2011. And it was a 10-day event, as you said. It was an iron distance triathlon. In fact, it was a fraction longer, just with the particular design of the course. But it was an amazing experience, I have to say. Very challenging, but just incredible experience, I have to say. I loved every minute of it.
One of the stories I know you've told me before is how you managed to get yourself through the last couple of days by counting them down. And I know there's an interesting story about your number plate on your car at the time. Tell me a little bit about that in terms of what the psyche of your mind was at that point.
Yeah, the Dakar, I learned so much, and as you so kindly said, it's in the book TikTok 10, and that, it was when I started to write that book in the year afterwards, and I know you're going through a similar journey yourself. So I'm sure you're recounting incredible detail about what your experiences, and I kept an audio diary. I used to talk either on the run course or when I was lying in the sleeping bag. I just used to talk about the day's experience that had just happened. So I had incredible detail of what had happened, and so I learned so many incredibly powerful mindset strategies, like incredibly simple things. And one of them, I didn't conceive it, it was my partner conceived it, but so it's a 10-day event. Very tired after day one, even more tired after day two, no rest days, kind of come back kind of 3 or 4 days later, you've 4 days left. Finished day 6, and I'm lying in a sleeping bag. I rang my other half, and she was back in Ireland, and I was monumentally tired, and she was trying to maybe motivate me or just give me some positive words across the phone. And she said, "How did your car registration finish?" In my car. I said, "Why are you asking me that?" And she said, "Just tell me." And I had been complaining about the fact that we still had another 4 days to go, and how tired I was, and people were dropping like flies in the event, and how are we going to keep going? And she said, she persisted, "How does it finish?" And I said, I had to think. And it finishes 4, 3, 2, 1. And she said, "Say it again." And I said, 4, 3, 2, 1. And she said, "Say it again." And I said, 4, 3, 2, 1. And she said, "Look how quickly you can say that." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's all you've left. 4 days, then 3 days, then 2 days, then 1 day. Why not just remind yourself of that tomorrow? Look how quickly you can say it. It'll be over that quickly. And Breifne, I'm certain 1,000 times the next day I repeated that out loud to myself, because I had so much time. You spent a lot longer on a bike than I did, but I averaged I think 8 or 9 hours a day on the bike, and I just kept repeating to myself, because, and I'm sure you would, in alignment with this, is, when you're at that extreme, you tap into. It's amazing what you tap into, the psychology of the simple. Like, I remember, I'd look at a signpost and I'd be consumed by the visualization of the signpost for hours. And yet you might have passed the signpost and never, you're smiling.
Yeah, absolutely,
so,
a song that could get stuck in your head or whatever it might be, absolutely. But no, I love that little story about just breaking it down into really simple tasks, because as the first line in your book, and I could be wrong in this, but I think the first line in your book is a quote, "A journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step." It's also actually the first words on my blog, which I wrote before I ever met you. And before your book even came out, we did it in isolation. I think the power of those simple lines is so true, is that you can't get to the third last day without getting to the fourth last day. And you talk about that in one of your books as well, about where you have to get through mile 1 to get to mile 2 before you can even think about mile 3. And if you break it down into simple things, if you then take mile 1 and break it down, it becomes achievable. Because you can run a mile. You can run a mile in your sleep. Nearly anybody of any fitness can get through a mile, and if you can get through the first mile, then maybe you can get through the second mile. For me on the bike, as you said, long days, my longest day was over 200 kilometers on the bike. But I used to break it down into stages of 20 kilometers. And that was my goal. I'll do an hour on the bike and I'll take a break. So if it's hot or if it's a lot of climbing, I'd do an hour, take a break, get a bit of water, maybe a quick bite to eat, I'm back on the bike. And I knew I could do an hour in my sleep. But if I just did an hour 10 times, you get 200 kilometers out of it without actually thinking about the total distance. And all of a sudden you find yourself a day later and you're 200 kilometers closer to the finish line. Your most recent publication, and you did mention Who Dares Runs, I mentioned Who Dares Runs, and you mentioned TikTok 10, which are about 32 marathons, and your personal story in Who Dares Runs. TikTok 10 is it's a more in-depth look at maybe what's going on physically and mentally with you in the 10 Ironman challenge in the summer of 2011, but the new book is a new direction for you. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because I think it's about what I want this podcast to be about, is how people listening to the show can actually take what what you've learned through these challenges, and actually maybe take 1 or 2 gems. So I'm going to ask you for 3, and hopefully people will take something from that. 3 little simple tricks that people can use to maybe achieve something small or big in their own lives. It might be sporting, it might be business related, it might be personal life, it might be whatever. It might be a new skill that they want to take, but maybe just 3 little concepts that they can take with them and go, I can actually do that thing that's been in the back of my mind for so long. You talked about how the 32 marathons thing was probably in the back of your mind for 15 years before you actually went public with it. I'm sure everybody has those kind of dreams and those kind of goals. So I'm going to put you a bit on the spot and ask you to pick 3 things that you think people will actually benefit from.
Okay. One of the greatest gifts I've been fortunate to stumble across is the value of exercise to help us in every goal that we might have in life. And we don't have to be into sport to be into exercise. Exercise can be, instead of driving to work, not even walking to work, but getting the bus and getting off 2 stops before the office building. That could be exercise for one person. It could be going up and down the stairs 3 or 4 times if you work on the second floor rather than taking the lift. It could be, literally having your sandwich, so you get an hour for lunch, and going and walking off the sandwich, So it could be simple things. If you're into sport, then it's obviously a lot easier. But I'm certain that apart from exercising early is one of the keys to achieving all your other goals. I think you would be more upbeat, you'd be more positive, you'd be more energized. And if you exercise in the morning, I think you will have more energy throughout your day. Exercising in the evening is great. I'm going to be doing it tonight myself. But as a framework for me to live my best life, I usually exercise minimum 5 mornings a week. And I do it for 3 reasons: for fitness and for my health, for fun, and for business. I'm a business person, and I'm absolutely positive, Breifne, it helps me in all walks of life, in all of my goals, and particularly in business, which I tend to spend 8 or 9 hours a day in. And I know I'm far better up for things if I've exercised early in the day. And in the book, The Goal Getter, 35 Different Ways to Reach Your Goals, there's 4 or 5 stories directly linked to exercise. And a lot of what I talk about is other people's experiences. They're not just my thoughts. They're irrefutable evidence of other people showing how it works for them and the value of it. So that's one of the things I'd be very keen to talk about, is the value of exercise to help us in all walks of life. Something else would be, how did I overcome my fear of public speaking? One thing is I just kept doing it and identified 4 years after I overcame the fear that I wanted to do it for a living.
Do you have an idea how many times you've gotten up and spoken in public since that first time? Stab in the dark?
I would say probably, gosh, that's a great question. It'd be hovering in and close to 1,000 at this stage, I would imagine. Probably, it's definitely closer to 1,000 than 500, Here's the thing. I decided in 2009 I wanted to do it for a living. There's a whole different story that we don't need to go into there. For how I arrived at that. When you consider where I was 4 years before, where it was my worst nightmare. But then I did it for almost 2 years as a full-time business, and the fear of Breifne was still there, because I was really, maybe now listeners are trying to realize just how big of a challenge it was for me. You might say, well, why are we doing it? But I actually, at this stage, I did love it, even though I was petrified of it. Even when I would get up in front of a corporate audience, I would be so nervous, for hours before it. But 10, 15 minutes in, I was just reliving. I loved it once I was up there. And the buzz that I got from it, and the feedback, and maybe the value that people got out of some of the things that I share. But here's the thing, kind of almost 2 years in, I'm still afraid of it. And a part of my mind was refusing to allow me to enjoy it, even though it's now my full-time business. And 2 final things, and I shared them in one of the later chapters of the book. One was a breathing technique, which I didn't understand the value of breathing as a strategy. Fantastic, I have to say. I'd love to go into that, but we don't have time. And the second thing was...
We have plenty of time.
Okay, well, I was listening, I was looking for any kind of a technique. And I was listening to the radio one afternoon, and this guy said, he just gave this breathing technique to help you with stress. And I tried it the next time in a presentation, and usually I'd be introduced on a stage, so I tried it a couple of days later. So I'm doing this breathing technique while I'm being introduced. So I know I'm going to speak in about 2 minutes. I can hear them talking about the next speaker, whatever. So I practiced this strategy. And when I started the strategy, my heart was doing like 110 beats a minute. literally within 30 seconds of the breathing technique, I could actually feel my heartbeat calming. And I said, gosh, maybe this works. So, and now I do it automatically because I still get nervous, but now I've learned to love it. The other huge learning was something my nephew taught me. And I do recount this story in the book about where he was asked, and he was 10 years of age at the time, he got the lead in a school play. And I foolishly, Breifne, and it only serves maybe to show up my own shortcomings, I asked him, you're the lead in a school play, what's the play? And he said, it was Peter Pan. And I said, will you be nervous? And I shouldn't have asked him the question because he looked at me as if to say, why on earth would I be nervous? But I persisted, which I shouldn't have done, but I did. I said, well, you have to go and get up in front of people, and how many will be there? And he said, 200. And I said, gosh, you have to perform. On reflection, I was just showing him my own shortcomings.
Yeah, he was, I suppose, the lack of fear of the youth, I suppose, was evident, and then you kind of destroyed that for him.
I could have. Thankfully, I didn't, but I could have, because this guy was so strong mentally, because he looked at me and he said, but Gerry, why would I be nervous? I did it last week. And I said, what do you mean you did it last week? And he said, well, I sang in front of the class last week. And then he asked me this question. He looked at me with total innocence in his eyes. And he said, I sang in front of the class last week. What's the difference? But the difference was in my mind, not his.
Yeah.
And I realised, I thought long and hard that evening. I said, this 10-year-old is teaching you something profound here. And that was the final jigsaw puzzle. Because I went back onto my laptop. I'd spoken for 2 years at this stage as a professional. And I looked at all of my client testimonials and I said, look what they've said about your work and the value that their employees or their customers got out of it. And I realised, Gerry, this is just a story going on in your head, and like this 10-year-old is teaching you something here. That's his psychology. You can now teach yourself that psychology yourself. And briefly, within 3 weeks, all the nerves, in the sense of being fearful of it, disappeared. Now I get nervous, but it's more adrenaline than nerves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. As a final, or maybe a third...
Third one, yeah. There's lots of different things. The
book is brilliant, by the way. I read it and I've read 2 of your books now in a single sitting. I think you just can't put them down when you start reading them. But I love it. It's so simple. You can just pop in and out of different stories, and kind of these are all just 35 different ways to achieve what you want to achieve. And I think there's something in each one of the stories that people can take out of. But yeah, what's your favorite?
I'll tell you what. It's probably my one of my greatest learnings. Probably my greatest learning, but also it's the certainly with the feedback. The book is out 3 months at this stage, and probably 1 in 3 people that send feedback through whatever medium refer back to chapter 2, and so therefore that might be a good thing to talk about. And chapter 2 is called Gratitude Attitude. What gratitude attitude is all about is realizing, a lot of us focus on what we don't have, not on what we do have. And a lot of us focus on, for example, I have to go and do a long run, or I have to work. Now, to run a marathon, you do have to do a long run. To meet your financial commitments, we do have to work. But I realize now that I just have a different psychology going on in my head through a few life experiences, some 5 years ago, some 15 years ago. But all of these things, because I've journaled all the learnings as I've gone through life in the last 10 or 15 years, I've managed to capture and retain the learnings that I got, and to follow through on letting them help me grow as a person. But realizing that I don't have to do things, that I get to do things, is probably the best thing I've ever learned. And it's simple psychology, because I'm fortunate now that I get to go to work. In 2009, my business was going through a tough time. And I realize now not to be complaining if I'm really busy, because, there was a time when I didn't have work, and, to be grateful for it. I was out, I couldn't run for 5 months in 2009, and that taught me I wanted to run then and I couldn't run. So that's where I learned do you have to do a long run, or do you get to do a long run? So that's probably, certainly the feedback from readers of the book, that's the one that most people are gravitated towards. And, being honest with you, it's something, it's now become automatic behavior for me to remind myself of that every day. And I tell a story later in the book about it, something I learned from an American psychologist, about expressing gratitude for 3 different things every day of your life, and how you can become happier in your life if you're willing to do that.
Fantastic outlook on everything. I think I've heard you speak about the fact that you get to do things. and it's a really, really good philosophy to have in terms of, I think of even, we're sitting here in your hometown of Mullingar as we're recording this, and I'm just thinking just down the road, someone who is equally as inspirational, Mark Rowan, the Paralympic champion of 2012, and double Paralympic champion and world champion, Mark Rowan, who's obviously a hand cyclist, having been paralysed in a motorbike accident in his late teens, early 20s. And 10, 12 years later, he's on the podium at the World Championship at the Paralympic Games in London, where a lot of people have an incident like that in their life where it changes their life and their entire a possibility of undertaking challenges. And Mark didn't let that get under his skin. He said, I can either mourn the loss of certain abilities for the rest of my life, or I can get on and try and make do with what I've done. And he went on to do fantastic things as well. But I think what you've achieved is equally as impressive in so many different ways. What does the future hold in store for Gerry Duffy in 2016 and beyond? Any major challenges or anything you can talk about today?
Well, one of the, there's a lot of quotes in the book, Breifne, and I know you've read it, so thank you for that. So you'll remember this quote, and it's about commitment. And 2.5 years ago, I made a commitment to myself to fulfill an educational goal, which I knew was going to test me significantly. And I'm in the final stages of that. And, but I still have, a significant chunk, albeit it's only over the next 2 or 3 months, of academic, learning and examination to follow through on. That's going to take everything. And I don't want to take my eye off the ball. And I'm as committed now as I was, because I talk about this stuff, I have to be very congruent with what I encourage other people to do. I'm incredibly locked into getting across the finish, and I do not want to take that for granted. I respect that goal 1,000%. And it's taking everything that I have in terms of, my academic ability, wherever I am. And commitment is doing what you said you would do long after the mood you set it in has left you. And there's plenty of times over the last 2.5 years where my mood hasn't been what my initial commitment was. But I've learned, the commitment, it's when you don't want to do it. That's when you really have to do it. And so that's one of my big boxes that I want to take over the next 3 months. And please God, in the next 3 months, I will have it finished. I started that in 2013, and we're talking about this as we go into 2016. So that's been a long journey. But, it's a bit like 32 marathons. I'm at marathon number 30, but it's about 32. In this case, it's about getting to the final examination. And you don't get any medals unless you finish the final examination. So I want to get there. That's a big one for me, a huge one. I have some very significant business goals in my business for 2016. And, in terms of sport, I'm doing an ultra marathon, and I'm going to chase a PB in that, so that'll be at a level above anything I've ever done before. So that's when we say
ultra marathon. I know you've done stuff that ranges from, say, the Connemara ultra marathon, which is I think 39 miles, right up to the 100k Connemara again, 100 kilometer. Is it 100 miles or 100 kilometers?
100 miles.
100 mile. I know you did that in the summer of
2014.
2014. I know I was away at the time, but I was following your progress via the wonders of social media. But in terms of which range are we looking at? Are we looking at the 160k or the 50k?
We're looking at it's 65k.
Okay.
So it's 39.3 miles, which is on my plan as we speak is to do it in April. Last year, being 2015, I wanted to do a personal best in standalone marathon. And I wanted to knock 2 minutes off my PB. And I'm going to be honest with you, sometimes people say, do you ever not achieve your goals? Lots of times. I spent 6-8 months trying to knock 2 minutes off my PB. I ran in last October in Frankfurt, and I missed it by 1.5 minutes. But to be honest with you, I
still a new PB though.
No, it wasn't a PB. No, I was 1.5 minutes slower than my previous.
Sorry, I thought you missed your target by 1.5 minutes.
But I was flying home, and I was saying, but couple of things. You've had a great year. I loved all of the training. I realised, that I was getting to do it, and how lucky was I, because you go back to Mark Rowan, and what I don't do challenges. I do ambitions and I do goals. Whereas Mark has overcome real challenges, what I call real challenges in life. And whereas I realise, now, that work is not a challenge, it's an ambition. Running is not a challenge, it's an ambition. And but I do, I'm very excited about 2016. I've 4 or 5 goals. Coming back from Frankfurt, not having achieved it, that's twice I've tried to knock my PB by 2 minutes, and that's twice I haven't succeeded. But what I've learned things on both occasions, and I've noted the learnings. I learned something quite significant in Frankfurt, and my plan later in the year is to try and push that PB again, and to put the 2 or 3 learnings I've got in those 2 failed attempts. Because if I can learn from them, and if I profit from them, and if I achieve my PB, then they're not failings, they're learnings. And that's a whole different ballgame.
So to quote Chumbawamba, I get knocked down, but I get up again. Is that the philosophy for 2016?
Would you like to sing it for the...
No, I'll pass on that. But it's one of those. Do Chumbawamba even sing? I don't know if you could call that. It's kind of more roaring. But no, the idea is, I suppose, that just keep moving forward and keep aiming towards that improvement. And if you keep trying, you will get there eventually. Is that the hope or the?
I think it is, but also, I wouldn't like people to think that I'm consumed with goal setting, because goal setting is different things to different people. I've learned the value and the excitement that life will gives us. I do think we should have goals, because if we have goals, we're pushing towards something, and we're here for a good time. We're not here for a long time. We're here for a good time or a great time, and we can have a great time. But I guess we have to have goals to have the great time. We can have a good time without maybe I'm getting very deep on this, but
No, we like deep on this show. It's fine.
Okay,
But to be fair, assuming people assume you're all about goals, when you write a book called The Goal Getter, people are going to naturally assume that is how you kind of motivate yourself on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely, but goals, of course, are different things for different people as well, and they don't have to be 10 iron distance triathlons in 10 days.
Thank God.
Yeah, they could be anything. It's always personal. It's whatever excites you. For somebody, it could be literally overhauling their garden. Wouldn't excite me, but my next door neighbour definitely. So different things for different people. It's the joy, it's the happiness that goals give us individually, because it's always personal at the end of the day.
The final question of the show, Gerry. If the listeners who have just spent the last 40 minutes or so listening to all that you've achieved in your life and the advice that you've given them, if you could ask them to do one thing for you, what would that be?
To do one thing for me or for them?
For you. How can the community of people who listen to this podcast help you?
Oh, okay. I had no idea you were going to ask me that question.
That's I want to catch on the spot.
How could they help me is to... Oh gosh, you absolutely stumped me with that one now. How can they help me? Maybe if they were encouraged by the book, The Goal Getter, 35 different ways to reach your goals, and if they like it, maybe recommend it. That'd be wonderful. If they don't like it, I'm in big trouble. But so far the feedback has been kind. But if they like the book, it's available on if I could plug the website.
Yeah, absolutely.
GerryDuffyAcademy.com. It's in hardback, it's in Kindle, it's in audio. And if they like it, maybe just recommend it to one person. And, I've learned a lot from other people. I've read so many books, and I continue to read a lot of books. And I love reading or listening to books. And so if my book can help people, I'd be very, very honoured. And maybe to give me feedback on it. I'd love that.
Well, I suppose on a personal level, and just in terms of quick feedback, I've read it from cover to cover once or twice at this point. And I think nearly everybody in my life got a copy of it in their Christmas stocking for 2015. So, and I know one or two of them looked at it and were very excited about the prospect of getting stuck into it. So it's a fantastic read, as are the other two, TikTok 10, and my personal favourite is Who Dares Runs, because I identify with a lot of what goes into that book and the personal journey that you're on, as well as just the physical exercise that makes up half of the book. Gerry Duffy, it's been an absolute pleasure to have had you as the first guest on the Breifne Earley show. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much.